Stanford University.
How can you be an astrobiologist because it's a subject that is completely imaginary? We have not found extraterrestrial life. But as all of you know, because you were wide awake during the first class, that astrobiology includes three questions. Where do we come from? So it's evolution writ large. Where are we going in the future? And are we alone? So are we alone is really only one of those. And it's a very worthwhile question whether we actually find life or not. Elsewhere, because if we don't, then our assumptions of what it takes to form life may need to be rethought. Because we're assuming at this point that if you have certain physical and chemical conditions, life is basically inevitable. And we'll be talking a lot more about that during the course of the semester, particularly when Frank Drake comes in to talk about SETI at the end. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about what life is. And so really the answer is, I don't feel bad about being an astrobiologist. How do biologists feel when you can't define life? And so let's see what we can do about defining life. It's important for us, of course, because how can we know that we found life elsewhere if we don't know what we're actually looking for? It's interesting because if you're studying the evolution of life, you have to know what you're studying the evolution of. And I mean, let's face it, it's our club. We are life, and so we are going to naturally be interested in life. And also there are moral and legal reasons. When does life begin? When does life end? And so on. And that's not even particularly easy to answer. So the trivial answer for many centuries, probably millennia, was life has some kind of vital principle. So you have this sort of imaginary thing in you, and that makes you alive. And when this imaginary thing evaporates, disappears, you're no longer alive. But the chemists show that that's not true. You can sit here and I can dissect frogs till I'm blue in the face. I can run them on gels. I can do all sorts of spectra on them, and I'm not going to find any vital principle. So that's kind of a bummer because that would have been very easy. Life is something that has this vital principle, and you describe it, and you say it's got this mass and these characteristics, and it's pink, and so on. But that's no good. So let's go into something a little bit more modern, serious. So what is this thing that we call life? Well, I discovered if you show puppy pictures, everyone loves it. My parents' dog when she was a puppy. I should mention that this is really a very short version of a lecture I gave for astrobiology students throughout Europe in Berlin just this past, I guess it was October. So what does life need? That's sort of one way to look at it. What is life made of? That's another possible way to look at it. What does life do? Some of these may sound silly, but these are all things that are taken very seriously right now. What do physicists maybe think about what life is? Life is an emergent phenomenon, and I'll explain what that means. This is sort of a little philosophy bit for today. And an operational definition that might be perfectly good to get us through the rest of the semester. So one thing is to take a look and see what life needs. Well, we're going to assume that life needs some kind of body, that you can't have this sort of gaseous, amorphous thing called life. And we think that it's going to be based on organic carbon. As Dr. Amendola pointed out, there's a lot of carbon in the universe. We see carbon-based compounds out there. We see this organic chemistry occurring in interstellar space through the universe, very much like what we see on Earth. And quite honestly, we're sitting on a very big silicate rock. And even though there are certainly days that I think that my brain's based on silicon, the bottom line is we are based on organic carbon. And this is a great place for silicon-based life, and we're not based on silicon. So let's assume that any life form out there is going to be based on carbon for these reasons. It needs to survive for some sort of period of time. I don't believe you can have an instantaneous life form that has no time component. There's got to be some continuity. We talk about it having to leave offspring so that you have some kind of generational continuity. But does it really have to have a body? I mean, you talk about something like a cellular slime mold, where you have these individual amoeba-like organisms that come together to form a single body and then separate again. So it's difficult to understand what actually is the body there, although there's always some kind of physical presence, some, these unicellular creatures going around, even if the fruiting body isn't present. What do we need to survive? How long is long enough to count as survival? What about leaving offspring? Does that mean that no one in this room is alive except Carlos and me because we have kids? None of you, I'm assuming, correct me if I'm wrong, is occasionally we do have students in the class who have children, but I'm assuming that no one else here besides Carlos and me has kids. So that means that Carlos and I are the only people alive. So that's the bad news for today. You obviously have the potential to have children. Not every one of you will, but you're still alive. So obviously there's something more than actually having offspring. And then sort of this continuity from generation to generation. Every one of you, I'm going to assume that every one of you has parents and grandparents and so on. There's been a continuity back to, as Gilbert and Sullivan said, the protoplasmic ooze. That doesn't mean you have to have children yourself, but there's some continuity backwards. But would that have to be true? I do not know for a fact that any of you were not simply created the morning of class, January was it 5th. I don't know that there's some place, I don't know, maybe they set up shop in the back of the bookstore and they create students to populate winter semester classes. I don't know that for a fact, but all of you are functioning like you're living human beings. So I'm going to give you credit for the fact that you are. I'm not going to go back and check each one of you. Excuse me, were you created January 5th in the morning, or are you a real live person? Can you prove it, and ask for ID? I'm going to give you credit. So these are kind of tricky little things here. So what about reproduction? Let's get back to this question of Carlos and I being the only ones who are actually alive in the room. A lot of people say, oh, you have to be able to reproduce, and that's why viruses are not alive. Now remember, viruses have either RNA or DNA, but they cannot reproduce themselves. They must take over some host cell's replicative machinery to make new DNA or RNA and new proteins to enclose themselves and to go off into the world. So they can't do it by themselves. And I won't mention names since this is being recorded, but I was at a dinner in the last year with some faculty who made a big deal. Well, viruses obviously are not alive because they can't reproduce themselves. And I looked at this person and said, can you reproduce without your wife? And he turned very red. Obviously, we don't reproduce as individuals either. Okay? So what I'm trying to do is stretch your minds a little bit on what could be sort of a very trivial question. What if you use a set of instructions? I'm just showing my first of a couple of Star Trek slides today. There's Data. He was created from a set of instructions. At what point do you say, well, you were created from instructions, so you don't count? And if you go back to the early organisms, clearly they were created by a set of instructions. What's going on in the field of synthetic biology right now is that several groups, including Craig Ventnor's, have taken the genome of a virus, synthesized it artificially, and put it in a cell and booted it up, got it to work. So is this alive? It's the exact same gene sequence as a naturally evolved virus, but they have now created it artificially and made this new strand of DNA or RNA and created a completely new artificial virus. And this is going on now with Mycoplasma genitalium, which is sort of a stripped down parasitic prokaryote. So it's not a virus, it's the next step on. This is where the field's going. At what point do you consider these alive? So what do we need for life? I mentioned that we're probably based on organic carbon, and here's sort of the stripped down periodic table. I know Luella Mendola showed you the astronomer's periodic table, which was very simple to memorize. It's like hydrogen, helium, and a little sprinkling of everything else. Well, here's the biologist's periodic table. We've got to have this carbon. As I argued a moment ago, it's the main constituent of organic materials. And after that, you certainly need hydrogen, but that's no problem. There's tons of that around. It's a nice space filler. Nitrogen is a constituent of proteins, nucleic acids, coenzymes, and so on. And so without nitrogen, you end up in a sugar world. Of course, my daughter would say, what's wrong with that? But nonetheless, we do need nitrogen. Hydrogen we need for organic material and certainly for water. Ditto for oxygen. We certainly use oxygen also as a terminal electron acceptor for respiration, but not all organisms do. Sulfur is a very important constituent of proteins and coenzymes. I'm doing these somewhat in order of their importance. Phosphorus, we clearly need for nucleic acids, phospholipids, nucleotides, coenzymes, and so on. And then we get into things like potassium, while you eat your bananas and that kind of thing, and magnesium. How many of these are actually required is a very interesting question. I would guess that the carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen are required, and then you start to get into phosphorus and sulfur, and could you imagine an organism that didn't have, for example, phosphorus? And I'm not a good enough chemist to really be able to give you a good answer, but these are interesting questions because you do hear people say over and over, oh, well, you need carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and then you've got to have maybe magnesium and so on. But I think what they're doing is saying, well, that's what all life on Earth uses, and therefore this must be what's true for all life. And as we're going to get into in the Replaying the Tape lecture to some extent, just because all life on Earth uses this particular suite of elements doesn't mean that you could not conceive of a life form that does not. You know, you could see in the grocery store, you know, this is completely sulfur-free, a phosphorus-free life form, or potassium-free, or whatever. I don't know, but that's completely possible. So let's move on to Erwin Schrödinger, who is a very famous physicist, Nobel Prize, blah, 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 blah. In 1944, he gave a series of lectures at Trinity College in Dublin. He obviously was German himself, but spent time in Dublin. And these talks were absolutely, you know, unbelievably popular. And so he ended up writing a wonderful book entitled What is Life? And it's extremely readable, extremely short. And it's considered a classic. Everyone refers to it. I finally sat down and read it a couple of years ago and then reread it when I gave this lecture in Berlin. And I highly recommend it. If you have, you know, an hour or two, it's worth skimming because people refer to it all the time and most people have not actually read it. But let me give you sort of the punchline. What he says is when a piece of matter is said to be alive because it goes on doing something, it moves or exchanges material with its environment and so on. But then he really gets into, again, a physicist's take of what is life. What they're doing is exchanging material with its environment and so forth for a much longer period than we would expect from an inanimate piece of matter to keep going under similar circumstances. When a system that's not alive is isolated or placed in a uniform environment, all motion usually comes to a standstill very soon. So in other words, it reaches some kind of equilibrium. After that, the whole system fades away in a dead, inert lump of matter. A permanent state is reached which no observable events occur, and this state is called by physicists thermodynamical equilibrium, or in other words, maximum entropy. So in other words, maximum randomness. And so what he argues is that life feeds on negative entropy. So we're keeping ourselves from fading away into thermodynamic equilibrium. Now, if you think about it, there is no good reason for probably anyone in this room to eat because we're all full-grown adult size. So we're not creating matter so that we can grow. What he would say is we're eating to feed ourselves negative entropy. Because if we didn't, entropy would start to take over, our bodies would reach a thermodynamic equilibrium, and we'd be dead. So what we're doing when we're eating is bringing in negative entropy to keep ourselves intact and alive. It's kind of an interesting way to think about your dinner tonight. You know, instead of saying, oh, this is a hamburger, this is negative entropy. Okay, what was very interesting to think about this, 1944, this is before the discovery of the structure of DNA. Again, looking at it as a physicist, what he was saying is that size matters, that organisms have to be large enough that you're not subjected to Brownian motion. So in other words, just random movements of single molecules or very small bits. And so you have to be some sort of a crystal. Life has to be based on some kind of aperiodic crystal is what he called it. And in fact, that's exactly what DNA is. So that was extremely prescient of him. And that's basically what the rest of this says. This last bit is, you could go on and ask, what is the minimum size for life if you start looking at it from a thermodynamic point of view? And what I recommended down there is an article by Arthur Koch on what size a bacterium should be. He's a microbiologist. I believe he's now retired at Indiana University. The reason this started to get a lot of press about, over 10 years ago now is because of the ALH 84001, which you'll hear about over and over in this class, the Mars meteorite, which was thought to maybe have some nanobacteria in it, some very tiny bacteria, but they would have been much smaller than any microbe on Earth. So the question then became, well, what is the smallest size that you could have a microbe? So if you're interested in these questions, that's a perfectly good article to jump in on. So if you're creating disequilibrium, like Schrödinger suggested, you have to have this negative entropy. You might fractionate isotopes. You might see that because you would not see a normal distribution of, for example, heavy carbon C13 or C14 to C12, and we'll mention that again in a few moments. An atmospheric disequilibrium. I think that was mentioned a little bit earlier in one of the classes about looking for life, that what we have, if you looked at our atmosphere, is we have a whole lot of oxygen. We have about 21% oxygen at the same time that we have about 80% diatomic nitrogen, so molecular nitrogen, which doesn't seem to make any sense from a chemical point of view, plus some methane and so on. And it's because we're continually pumping out that oxygen, so we're keeping this chemical disequilibrium. And so again, that's what many people think is a big indication, if you were to look at other planets, that there's life there by some kind of chemical disequilibrium. Okay, second approach could be to look at what life does. And you see this kind of approach all the time. People say, well, and here I just picked, one person to pick on, Ike, in 1995, life is capable of self-reproduction, mutation, metabolism. But again, I could be a little bit facetious and say, well, therefore, Carlos and I are the only live ones in the room. I don't know if any of you have mutated since the day you were conceived or not. That may be a little unfair. I know that all of you have eaten. But what if you didn't have one of these characteristics? Would you still be alive? What about a mule, for example, that can't reproduce? And as we went through, what if individuals are not reproducing? Because there are always going to be some individuals not reproducing. And then we could try to do it the other way around. Are there other things that metabolize? There are people, colleagues of mine, who make the argument that fires are capable of metabolism. They're sitting there oxidizing things, burning things all the time, just like we're doing at a much more controlled level. Does that make them alive? Is the engine of your car alive? And we could get into viruses, which I'll get into a little bit more in the next lecture. So we'll avoid that because we get Mimi virus twice. This is the sort of problem with trying to balance two lectures that weren't opening. We could use the Lego principle, and this is something that Chris McKay came up with, and he'll talk about that towards the end of the semester a little bit more. But his idea is that we have a whole series of interlocking components, and so that's how we know that life is one piece here. We only use L amino acids and D sugars. All life on Earth does. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't equally well have a life form that uses D amino acids and L sugars. These are just stereoisomers of these sugars. And there's no reason you couldn't do that. It's just that we haven't. But those organisms who use D amino acids and L sugars would have a very difficult time eating us. They would have terrible indigestion. They wouldn't be able to access all those, wonderful parts of their body that you would expect to have for dinner. So what he's saying is it's like having two different Lego sets, like a Lego set and a Lincoln Log set. You can't interchange the pieces, even though they're two different, they're both alive. Okay, so then we could describe its properties, and this is what most people seem to do, and this kind of irritates me because it really is a little bit self-serving. It's looking at what life on Earth is like and trying to extract certain elements that all life on Earth has, but again, that doesn't get to the question of, are all of these necessary for life? And so the person I'm going to pick on here is Shinsheimer, and he says that they had a flexible, self-made bounding membrane, coordinated groups of specific catalysts, molecular machinery, hereditary system of information storage. I mean, again, this is really just describing what we see for life on Earth today. Interlocking control systems, that's sort of similar to what I was talking about with the Lego principle, and provision of means for defense. Now, are all these things really necessary to be alive? Along those lines, Koshland wrote a very interesting piece in Science a couple of years ago, an editorial, and again, I give the reference at the bottom, and I'm hoping that you'll chase up a few of these because they're very thought-provoking articles, and most of them are extremely short. And he's saying a very similar sort of thing. You have to have a program, sort of like a DNA. You have to be able to have some kind of improvisation, compartmentalization, energy, flow, reproduction, adaptability, seclusion, and you're already probably starting to look at this list and saying, well, do we really need all these sorts of things? I'm going to argue that life actually is probably an emergent property. Emergence in biology means some very specific things, for example, the appearance or coming out of a bud and so on. But in philosophy, emergence means that you cannot predict something from the lower levels. And the example I love using is table salt, sodium chloride. Now, sodium is this sort of lump of kind of boring metal, and chlorine gas is extremely toxic. So just knowing that, who on earth would want to put some of that on your dinner? I mean, you'd be crazy. But in fact, when you mix the chlorine and the sodium and you get sodium chloride, you end up with this very benign salt that we all, love to put on French fries and so on. So the properties that we see with table salt are emergent. We could not necessarily predict those from knowing everything about chlorine gas and everything about sodium as a metal. So maybe that's a similar sort of thing with biology, that you can know everything anyone could possibly know about physics and chemistry, and you still would not be able to predict what would happen when you put these molecules together into a living organism, that it's an emergent property. There are lots of examples of what I would consider emergent properties in biology. I don't think I gave the reference there, but I actually had a paper in a philosophy book a couple of years ago talking about these things. We could talk about the origin of self-replication, metabolic pathways, the eukaryotes, and so on. All of these, I would argue, at some level are emergent properties. So maybe life itself is an emergent property. If you reverse this in a philosophical sense, what you're saying is that you cannot reduce life and expect to completely understand it. And reductionism has really been the mode of operation in science, particularly biology, for the last 100 so years, that you can always understand things by going to lower and lower levels. And that's one of the reasons people are so fascinated with molecular biology. That's the way you really understand what's going on. Counting rabbits and lynxes and stuff, it just gives you some kind of higher order thing. But if you really want to understand, you have to reduce the problems to a lower and lower level. But at some point, you may not be able to, because the higher level may be an emergent property. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So let's look for just a, actually, I'm not going to, I have the same slides in the next lecture, so we're just going to leave those out. But I do want to leave you with this quote from Nisbet and Sleep, Norm Sleep, of course, here in the geology department, and that is that defining the point at which autocatalysis becomes life is like searching for the world's smallest giant. Okay, I think that that's a marvelous quote. It's very difficult, it would be very difficult to pinpoint that time that you switch from autocatalysis, maybe some kind of self-replicating RNA or whatever, to what you would consider life. And this is another quote which I think is a marvelous one. This is more in support of what I was talking about with emergence. Jack Szostak and some of his colleagues who are all very prominent in the field of molecular evolution. Jack Szostak just got the Nobel Prize this year for a work that, actually not that he did an Origin of Life, although he may well get a second Nobel Prize for that someday, but in other work that he did on yeast years ago. And that is that we can consider life as a property that emerges from the union of two fundamentally different kinds of replicating systems. Informational, so that would be something like DNA that can give you, or think of maybe the software in your computer, and then the structure in which it resides. So you can think again of some having to have some kind of body, some kind of cell. Oops, I meant to take out the word Schrodinger there. So this is now a philosopher's approach. So this is, I think, going to be about the last one I'm going to try on you. These are just, it's sort of like going into a clothing store. I'm giving you a couple of different definitions and approaches that you can try and see what you like. So this one is an approach that Carol Cleland, who is a philosopher at the University of Colorado, and Chris Chiba, who was at the SETI Institute at the time, was at Stanford for a while and is now a professor at Princeton, came up with in a series of papers. Well, first of all, if you go into the philosophical literature, there are various different kinds of definitions, like operational definitions. For example, you could talk about university. University could be Stanford or could be any lesser sort of university and so on. But they're all universities. Or acid maybe is anything that turns litmus paper red. It doesn't really tell you what it is, but you can define a group, you can give it some kind of operational definition, and that's fine. Or you could have an ideal or a full or a complete definition that gives you a conceptual framework and makes it easier to understand. For example, the example they use is that a bachelor is an unmarried male. Okay, now what kind of definition might we need to approach for life? Well, what they suggest is something that's like a natural kind definition, something that there really is some kind of conceptual framework behind. Because think about the kinds of definitions we've been going over, these descriptive ones. They say, well, it's like this, this, and this, it does this, this, and this, and therefore it's life. But that doesn't really give you a good feeling for its essence, which makes you wonder, is there some kind of natural kind? Like chair, there's some kind of essence of chairness, or bachelor, or fortnight, 14 days, we always know what that is. So let's take a great example here. Let's look at water. Now, a non-natural definition is, here's a marvelous one that I love out of Da Vinci. 1513 is probably the only time we're going to quote Da Vinci this semester. Water is sometimes sharp and sometimes strong, sometimes acid, sometimes bitter, sometimes sweet, sometimes thick or thin. Sometimes it's seen to bring hurt or pestilence, sometimes health-giving, sometimes poisonous. It suffers change into as many natures as there are different places through which it passes. As the mirror changes with the color of its subject, so it alters with the nature of the place, becoming noisome, laxative, astringent, sulphurous, salty, incarnadined, mournful, raging, angry, red, yellow, green, black, blue, greasy, fat, or slim. Now, how do you feel about that definition of water? In contrast, how do you feel about this definition? Water is H2O. You have a really good natural kind description. Da Vinci's was very much of a description based on the characteristics that he could see. H2O is a natural kind definition. So I'm sure you can see what we're leading up to. Maybe our problem is that we need a natural kind definition for life, but we haven't been able to find one. And maybe that's because we haven't found this essence of life. So we're almost full circle. Wouldn't it be marvelous if life had some kind of vital principle? And then you could say a natural kind definition of life is anything with a vital principle. If this table got a vital principle, it would be alive. No problem. Maybe there is some kind of natural kind definition for life, and we just haven't found it. But to me, the reason it's so dissatisfying to see all these descriptive definitions is I feel they're very much like Da Vinci's description of water. I don't think I can do any better right now myself, but I'm still left with that feeling that we have not come up with a natural kind definition. The problem is we need some operational definition, because we can't really go to Mars or Europa or something and see some creature and you say, gosh, you know, we really don't have a natural kind definition for you yet, so, you know, just hang out here and we'll get back to you when the philosophers have sorted this out. So we need some kind of operational definition to get us through. And on a more practical level, there are people who are very concerned about when life actually begins, when life ends. That's a picture that I took of a dead hippopotamus last time I was in Africa. You don't see them sort of floating around very often. Synthetic biology, when have you actually created life, something you consider life? And again, astrobiology, which is why we're particularly interested. Where is this, you know, life? We need to be able to define it if it's in our neighborhood. We certainly want to know if it's life if we get something from beyond. So NASA, of course, in its infinite wisdom, has come up with a couple of definitions. Working definition, something like this: life is a self-sustained chemical system capable of undergoing Darwinian evolution. And they said, well, what if it doesn't undergo Darwinian evolution? What if it doesn't go through natural selection? There are lots of organisms that don't. And there are lots of instances. In fact, I would say that you probably could come up with any harebrained scheme for change, and there is some idiot insect out there that's done it. I mean, there's a lot out there besides natural selection. Natural selection is probably the predominant mode. That's why we're so focused on it. But there are a lot of other mechanisms. So do we really have to undergo Darwinian evolution to count as being alive? And then there's the sort of, we'll know it when we see it. Justice Potter Stewart said, you know, when he was asked to define pornography, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And there are people who sort of take that approach to life as well. I can't define it, I know it when I see it. Is natural selection necessary? The way that picture on the right, of course, is Darwin. The picture on the left was one of the pages from, I think, The Origin of Species. It was one of his manuscript pages. And the funny thing is, the only reason this was unearthed recently is because of that drawing on the left that two of his kids drew. Two of them, and he kept it because of the kids' drawing, not because it was his manuscript. Gives you an idea of what he was like as a man. Okay, so NASA tends to include natural selection, but there are other mechanisms. So let's go back to the puppy picture. So So what does life need? We've talked a little bit about that. It needs carbon, we think, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen. At some point I get a little fuzzy on what it really needs and what is just common to life on Earth. We could look at what life's made of, what it does. We could look in terms of life being something that fights entropy, and that, you know, that almost may be as good a natural kind definition as we can get back to at this point. We could do worse than go back to Schrodinger in 1944. Life is an emergent property, so we don't have a way to describe it yet because it isn't something that can be understood simply by understanding the lower levels. We could do this philosopher's take and again focus on the fact that we do not have a natural kind definition, either because we don't understand enough about life, or perhaps there is no natural kind definition and it's something that we can only describe on Earth. But we do certainly need an operational definition, and this is just sort of a moment of levity for today. At one point I was in some contact with the science advisor for Star Trek, and I said, you guys must have to deal with this all the time. How do you create a creature that people will recognize as alive? And he said that Gene Roddenberry recognized a couple of things. If a creature has eyes, we recognize it as alive. If it's sentient, in other words, it can function as a human being, even if you can't see it across a blank wall. Like if I were playing chess with someone on the other side of the wall and they were making moves that I would expect from a living organism, I give them the credit for being alive. Behavior, for example, if there's maternal behavior, they said people recognize that as being alive. So even if it looks like a bunch of little rocks, if it looks like a mother rock herding her little baby rocks, we tend to give it credit for being alive. And then there's the whole question, if they evolve, we tend to give it credit for being alive. Okay, so we can describe it pretty well, that's true. It appears to be an emergent property, but defining it eludes us, perhaps because there is no natural kind, or we just don't know enough to be able to define it. We need to be able to define it. So let's come up with some kind of practical definition. And now we're sort of getting into my take here. Life is historical. We know that. So that every creature, even if all of you were created, as I said, behind the bookstore the morning of January 5th, you don't need to bring me a note from your parents, but you know, even if you were, since then you've become historical creatures. You've all gone through your days, you've all have very different experiences and so on now. So they're historical creatures in contrast to, for example, a hydrogen atom. And I don't really care, the hydrogen atom that's in my finger, whether it was created in a Big Bang or during a supernova or whatever. It doesn't matter to me because every hydrogen atom is interchangeable. None of you are interchangeable. All of you have had a unique history that does matter. Life must do everything possible to ensure survival of its species. So if it doesn't bother trying with that, it's going to go extinct. But if it doesn't bother, it's still alive until it goes extinct. But in a way, the definition goes to the victors, because it may be that if you asked a virus what is alive, they may have a very definition than we do, and obviously we're the only ones around who are thinking about it. So that's why we're able to get away with some of these descriptive definitions that are probably very self-serving. And again, I would suggest at this point it's a natural kind, and maybe really what you have to say at this point with our knowledge of life, you just have to say it's a matter of taste.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.